They hammered steel fences across my family's land at sunrise, never dreaming that I held my grandfather's last will, proof that he bequeathed me far more than just a patch of dirt. What would you do if your own birthright was fenced off by the very people sworn to protect your neighborhood? Let me know in the comments. Where are you tuning in from today? Because you won't believe what happens next. I woke up to the sound of a chainsaw roaring in the distance, its sharp growl echoing through the otherwise peaceful morning air. This was supposed to be a quiet Sunday in Oak Springs, a suburban neighborhood in the heart of the United States, where lawns were perfectly trimmed and families chatted over cups of coffee on white wraparound porches. That day, however, something felt off. I remember glancing out my bedroom window and seeing a group of workers in matching uniforms, cutting away at the dense shrubbery that separated my property from the main road. My first thought was confusion. Why were they working on my land without so much as a warning? I hurried downstairs, grabbed a coat, and slipped into my boots, determined to figure out what was going on. When I marched out toward the commotion, I saw a tall metal fence being erected, segment by segment, along a newly cleared perimeter. They were moving with ruthless efficiency, installing posts and stretching wire as if they had every legal right to claim that portion of my land. It was the Oak Springs Homeowners Association, commonly known as the HOA, behind it all. Their official trucks were parked outside, and a stern-faced project manager was directing the entire operation with a clipboard in hand, acting as though my property was theirs to modify. It took me a moment to grasp the extent of what was happening. The land I stood on wasn't just a generic suburban lot, it was my birthright. An inheritance from my late grandfather, Robert Adams. He had bought this small piece of paradise decades ago, long before Oak Springs transformed into a meticulously curated neighborhood with ironclad rules. My grandfather had always cherished his independence. He disliked the idea of a neighborhood committee dictating paint colors or front yard decorations. In fact, he had insisted that I maintain this land just as he had, free from overreaching regulations and petty arguments. Watching the HOA's workers methodically fence off a chunk of the property that he'd entrusted to me felt like a betrayal, not just to me, but to his memory. As I demanded an explanation from the project manager, I received a curt reply, "You'll have to address any concerns at the next HOA meeting." The abruptness of that statement ignited a determination in me that I hadn't felt in years. Rather than storming off in rage, I decided to bide my time, to find some legal footing. I had always assumed that my grandfather's will was straightforward. The property belonged to me, no strings attached. But something about the HOA's actions suggested they believed otherwise. That night, after a tense day spent helplessly watching the fence go up, I sat down with a warm mug of chamomile tea and pulled out every document related to the property. The old deed, some property tax records, and a worn folder with my grandfather's personal notes were there. Nothing indicated any concessions made to the HOA. My confusion deepened. I wondered if there was an additional clause in the property records that I'd overlooked, something that might give them the right to erect fences or claim a portion of the land. I remembered vaguely that my grandfather had once spoken of a possible boundary dispute from years ago, but at the time it had seemed more like a casual anecdote than a real concern. Now, in the quiet of my living room, I replayed his voice in my head, trying to recall all the details he'd ever mentioned. Curiosity drove me to return to a place I had not visited in ages, the small attic in my grandfather's house. Although I now lived here, I rarely ventured up there, preferring to keep my memories alive through the keepsakes he left downstairs. Climbing the creaky wooden steps that led into the dusty loft, I felt an odd mixture of nostalgia and a hint of fear. The space smelled like old books and forgotten furniture, but as I flipped on the single naked light bulb, my eyes landed on a wooden chest in the corner. Its rusted latch told me it hadn't been opened in quite some time. Inside were letters, photographs, and miscellaneous documents. My breath caught when I saw something labeled "Last Will and Testament, Robert Adams." This must have been a draft or an alternate copy, something I didn't recall seeing after his funeral. I laid it gently on an old table and started flipping through the pages. My hands shook with a combination of excitement and dread. If the official will was different from what the family lawyer had shown me, it could mean trouble or possibly salvation. Leafing through the pages, I discovered paragraphs that not only declared me the sole owner, but also referenced a boundary adjustment from many years ago. The text mentioned the land's original markers, which had been set by my grandfather and an old county surveyor when the neighborhood first started expanding. It hinted that there had been some confusion regarding the official boundary line, but my grandfather had insisted that the land extended a certain number of feet beyond a nearby creek, an area that was now included in Oak Springs' official plan. My heart rate accelerated. If this was authentic, the fence the HOA was building might be on property that was, beyond any doubt, legally mine. Yet the text also included references to conditions about preserving the land in a certain manner, a promise my grandfather had made to the county in exchange for a permit decades ago. I wasn't entirely clear on the details, but something about the combination of partial farmland, protected trees, and local tax incentives stood out to me. I realized I needed professional guidance to interpret it all. The next morning, I asked around for a good real estate attorney. I ended up visiting a small law firm located in the historic district of town. The dusty leather couches and faded law books on oak shelves gave off a comforting old-world vibe that matched the seriousness of my predicament. There I met with a calm, meticulous lawyer named Sarah Turner. She combed through the newly discovered will with such precision it felt like she was dissecting every word for hidden codes. By lunchtime, she leaned back in her chair, her brow furrowed. According to Sarah, the biggest issue was not whether I owned the land, but rather how this older documentation, with its references to an adjusted boundary, might conflict with subsequent neighborhood expansions. She suggested a thorough title search and recommended bringing in a surveyor to establish the correct lines. Her legal curiosity was piqued by one peculiar line mentioning the orchard, a small patch of fruit trees that apparently used to grow behind the creek. Sarah wondered if some orchard had once existed where the HOA was now building their fence, and whether that orchard played a critical role in grandfather's arrangement with the county. After leaving the law firm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing a crucial puzzle piece. On my way home, I stopped by an old diner that my grandfather used to love. The place was a relic, with a neon sign that had flickered for as long as I could remember. There I encountered Tom, a retired county official who had known my grandfather. Tom had watery blue eyes but a sharp memory. When I casually mentioned the orchard, his face lit up with recognition. He told me that my grandfather's orchard had been a local legend, producing the juiciest peaches and apples in the region. More importantly, it sat on land that extended past the creek, territory that might now be under dispute. He recalled that many years ago my grandfather had a run-in with a development corporation that wanted to buy up that stretch of land. My grandfather refused to sell, though the company lobbied heavily. Eventually the land was never sold, but Tom suspected something might have been filed at the county level that complicated the official boundary lines. He urged me to head to the county archives to see if the orchard had been included in any zoning or annexation measures. My search led me to the Oak Springs County Records Building, an imposing gray structure with an interior that smelled of freshly printed paper and old coffee. Rows of filing cabinets, microfilm machines, and cautious librarians filled the space. I felt a tinge of nervousness. Bureaucratic buildings often had a way of making people feel small, like cogs in a vast, unyielding machine. Nonetheless, I located the department that handled historical property records and explained my quest to an archivist named Danielle, who specialized in old documents. She frowned when I described my situation, remarking how often HOAs tried to overstep boundaries without checking deeper into property history. Together, we pored over microfilm documents and battered manila folders. Finally, we stumbled upon a record from the late 1970s, detailing a formal request from the Oak Springs Development Group to incorporate a significant strip of land along the creek. The request was pending in the sense that it had never been fully withdrawn, nor had it been approved. It was in some bureaucratic limbo. According to the notes, part of that strip included my grandfather's orchard. Danielle pointed out that if the orchard land remained part of my grandfather's property, as indicated by his older will, it could invalidate any claim the HOA might have in that area. This was because no official annexation or boundary shift had been completed. The fence they were building might literally be on land they didn't own. With newfound hope, I returned home determined to confront the HOA. By the time I arrived, their construction crew was already installing the final sections of the fence. There was something brazen about the speed at which they worked, as if they wanted to finish before anyone could object. I snapped several photos, made notes, and prepared for the next HOA meeting. My frustration mingled with excitement at the prospect that all of this might soon be rectified. But beneath it all, I sensed something else, an undercurrent of intrigue. Why were they so eager to claim this land? Was it just about controlling the neighborhood boundaries, or was there some hidden agenda? Before long, word spread that I was challenging the HOA. Neighbors started whispering among themselves, some offering quiet support while others seemed wary of stirring the pot. Oak Springs had always prided itself on uniformity and order, and many residents believed that the HOA's rules were essential to maintaining the suburban utopia they cherished. A few longtime neighbors, though, confided in me that they had encountered similar heavy-handed tactics over the years. Smaller fines for paint colors deemed too bright, disputes about lawn ornaments, or petty disagreements over fence heights. One woman, Mrs. Connolly, even recalled that the HOA tried to block her from putting up a wheelchair ramp for her husband, citing aesthetic concerns. She took them to court and won, but the ordeal left her exhausted. Hearing that, I realized this conflict ran deeper than a single fence on my property. People in Oak Springs had been subjected to the HOA's overreach for a long time, and perhaps the orchard fiasco was just the latest manifestation. The upcoming HOA meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening in the community center, a modest building next to the largest park in Oak Springs. The center had multi-purpose rooms for yoga classes and homeowner gatherings, with big windows that offered a pleasant view of a pond. That night, however, the air was thick with tension. Residents crowded into metal folding chairs, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Seated at the front of the room was the HOA board, a group of 5 people who exuded an air of authority. The board president, Ms. Harding, wore a crisp suit and carried an aura of determination. She introduced the agenda in a clipped tone, as though this was merely a formality. When my turn finally came, Ms. Harding begrudgingly invited me to speak. I rose, my heart pounding, and presented what I had discovered. I recounted the orchard and the evidence from the county archives that indicated no official transfer of land had occurred. I held up the copy of my grandfather's last will, reading a key portion that specified the orchard and the land extending beyond the creek remained in our family. Ms. Harding's eyes flashed with annoyance, and a man beside her, presumably the HOA's legal advisor, tried to interject. He claimed they had every right to build where they did based on maps from more recent planning sessions, but I could see cracks in their confidence. The tension in the room was palpable as the crowd muttered. A few voices piped up asking why the HOA would build fences on property that was under dispute. Ms. Harding tried to quell the unrest by announcing they had followed proper procedure, that a new development plan had mandated an easement, and that the fence installation was necessary for security, yet I recognized her attempts to maintain control. She seemed rattled. At that point, Sarah Turner, my attorney, rose from her seat in the back. She spoke with the calm authority of someone used to diffusing tense legal standoffs. She outlined how the older record still held weight unless formally overturned, and how the HOA's development plan might be invalid if it encroached on unincorporated land. More importantly, she emphasized that the will's explicit mention of the orchard indicated my grandfather had never consented to annex that area. My mind drifted for a moment, back to a memory of me and my grandfather walking through the orchard on a spring afternoon. He had pointed out the blossoms, explaining how each flower, if pollinated, would become a piece of fruit. "That's how life works," he'd say. "Small beginnings can yield big rewards if nurtured properly." I suddenly felt a wave of warmth, like he was right there beside me, encouraging me not to back down. By the time Sarah finished, the room was buzzing. People were talking over one another, and Ms. Harding's attempts to restore order seemed to flail. The board quickly moved to table the issue, stating they needed time to review the documents. It was a temporary victory, but I could sense something bigger brewing. Walking out of the meeting, several neighbors approached me, thanking me for standing up to the HOA. A man named James, a father of two, explained how he'd been fined for letting his kids draw chalk art on the sidewalk. Another neighbor, Carmen, said the HOA once threatened to sue her for planting flowers deemed not in line with the neighborhood's aesthetic. Their stories confirmed that my fight wasn't just personal. I was indirectly fighting for everyone who had ever been pushed around by unnecessary regulation. In the days that followed, I began to sense that the HOA's posture was more aggressive than ever. Their newsletters, usually filled with updates about community picnics or landscaping tips, now included veiled references to neighborly compliance and the need for consistent standards. A portion of the newsletter said, "Any unauthorized changes or disputes will be met with legal action." It was hard not to read that as a direct threat. At the same time, I discovered a notice taped to my front door one morning informing me that the fence was for the betterment of the community and that any effort to remove or alter it would result in penalties. That evening I caught myself pacing my living room, staring at the newly erected fence in the distance. It was an ugly scar on what used to be open land, and it represented so much more than a property line dispute. It was a symbol of control, a brazen attempt to undermine my rights and my grandfather's legacy. Determined not to let this slide, Sarah and I filed a formal objection with the county. We also alerted local media. A sympathetic reporter from a small newspaper, the Oak Springs Chronicle, came by to interview me. She was intrigued by the story of a homeowner who'd discovered an old will that contradicted the neighborhood's official map. Her piece ran on the front page under a bold headline, "Local Man Battles HOA Over Family Orchard." It was the talk of the town for a week. Some residents were annoyed by the attention, but many quietly cheered me on. The HOA board, on the other hand, was livid. Ms. Harding fired back with a press release insisting the association was merely safeguarding neighborhood interests. Tension escalated further, and the subtle hostility turned into open antagonism. One night I heard footsteps near the fence line. When I checked through my window, I saw two figures with flashlights surveying the area. It was too dark to identify them, but I suspected they were either HOA affiliates or private security. They appeared to be measuring distances, perhaps trying to confirm the boundary for themselves. The next morning, I found patches of my grass churned up, as if someone had stomped around with heavy boots. That incident shook me more than I cared to admit. It felt like a message. We know where you live and we can come around any time we want. However, it also bolstered my resolve. This wasn't just about a few feet of land. This was about my right to live without harassment, about honoring my grandfather's memory, and about standing up to a group that believed it could bulldoze anyone in its path. Amid these developments, the local judge agreed to hold a preliminary hearing to decide whether the fence should remain or be removed until the matter was resolved. This hearing felt like the opening salvo in a larger legal battle. Standing in the modest, wood-paneled courtroom, I felt a strange mix of nerves and confidence. The judge was a stern-looking woman with silver hair. She asked the HOA's representative to explain the legal basis for building the fence on disputed land. Their attorney, a tall man with a booming voice, tried to present a map that portrayed the orchard area as part of the Oak Springs community. Then Sarah countered with the older documents. She pointed out how no official transaction showed that orchard territory had ever been legally annexed. When the judge asked for original copies, we handed over the will, the county records, and photos of the orchard from decades ago. The orchard's existence in living color seemed to captivate the judge. It was more than theoretical lines on a map. It was something real that had once provided fruit for families and friends. By the end of the hearing, the judge seemed inclined to place a temporary injunction on the fence, indicating that until the boundary dispute was resolved, the fence might be considered an encroachment. The HOA's lawyer looked visibly displeased. A wave of relief washed over me, but I also felt an undercurrent of anxiety. My battle was far from over. That was just a preliminary hearing. The judge's decision gave me a bit of breathing room, but the real challenge, proving definitively that the orchard land remained mine, still loomed. If the records were incomplete or the original orchard site was smaller than we believed, the HOA could still gain an upper hand. Meanwhile, the community was growing more divided. Some residents felt we needed to preserve property rights and stand against the HOA's tyranny. Others worried that too much negative press could lower property values. The entire neighborhood felt on edge. Several days later, while rummaging through more of my grandfather's old documents, I found a key detail I had missed. In the back of an old notebook, there was a reference to something called the Adams Conservation Clause. It appeared to be an agreement between my grandfather and the county, stating that as long as the orchard was maintained as a conservation area, the land would remain outside any future development boundaries. If it was ever discontinued, the county might consider rezoning it. The orchard had been abandoned after my grandfather fell ill, and eventually the trees died. This was likely the loophole the development company had tried to exploit years ago. But the orchard still belonged to our family. No official rezoning had been approved, even if the orchard wasn't maintained. I felt like I had uncovered the golden ticket. However, the orchard's current state was nothing more than an overgrown patch of brush. The only way to emphasize that the Adams Conservation Clause should remain valid was to show some intent to restore the orchard. I realized that to strengthen my case, I might need to resurrect the orchard my grandfather loved so dearly. In a move that some might see as symbolic, I bought saplings, apples, peaches, and pears, and began clearing the brush. I hired local laborers to help replant what had once thrived there. Day by day, we toiled under the sun. It was hard work, but strangely cathartic. Neighbors would sometimes pass by and watch from the sidelines. A few approached cautiously and offered to help, drawn in by the romance of reviving a beloved piece of local history. With every hole we dug for a sapling, I felt a deeper connection to my grandfather. News of the orchard's comeback spread quickly, and so did the rumors. Some said I was performing a stunt to strengthen my legal claim, while others lauded me for restoring a lost piece of the town's heritage. The HOA responded with a new set of rules, claiming that large-scale plantings had to be approved by them first. I was outraged. This was land they claimed wasn't even mine, yet they now insisted they had the authority to approve plantings? The hypocrisy was glaring. Sarah advised me to ignore these new rules for the time being and focus on the upcoming legal proceedings. Despite the pettiness, I found myself smiling during the orchard work. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice, telling me how proud he was. The real turning point arrived unexpectedly on a day that started with a minor fiasco. I had gone shopping for fertilizer and nearly got sideswiped in the grocery store parking lot by a hurried driver. After that jolt, I decided to treat myself to a coffee in the old downtown area. It was there, in a small cafe, that I ran into a former official from the Oak Springs Development Group. He was sitting alone, nursing a latte and reading the newspaper. Though older now, I recognized him from photographs I'd seen in the county archives. Deciding to push my luck, I introduced myself and explained the orchard situation. To my surprise, he invited me to sit down. He confided that when the development group first moved into Oak Springs, they were keen to acquire my grandfather's orchard land because of rumored mineral deposits beneath the soil. At the time, big businesses were also eyeing the region. He said there was even talk of a pipeline or drilling project. This official believed the orchard was the single major holdout preventing extensive industrial development, something many neighbors might not have known. He suspected the HOA's push to build that fence had more to do with safeguarding future corporate interests than it did with beautifying the neighborhood. That revelation shook me. It meant that the fence was likely the first step in a plan to claim all the orchard land, possibly for a deal with corporate developers. Armed with this new perspective, I contacted a local investigative journalist, the same one who had broken my story earlier. She was intrigued by the angle of secret corporate deals and the HOA's involvement. Within a week, she ran a follow-up piece questioning whether the HOA had an undisclosed financial agenda. Public sentiment started shifting more decidedly in my favor. People who had once believed I was just being difficult began to see that this dispute wasn't merely about lines on a map. It was about exposing potential collusion and protecting local land from corporate exploitation. The orchard was quickly becoming a symbol of community values versus corporate greed. In the midst of all this, I found an unexpected ally, a retired judge named Patterson. He had presided in Oak Springs for decades before his retirement and was known for his fair, no-nonsense rulings. Apparently, he had been following the story, and while the orchard restoration continued, I noticed subtle acts of vandalism. Saplings were broken, orchard tools went missing, and my mailbox was smashed one night. Though I couldn't directly prove it, I suspected someone aligned with the HOA or a corporate interest wanted to intimidate me. Calls to the local police produced little results. They took down the details but didn't seem eager to launch a full investigation. Despite the frustration, I refused to be cowed. In fact, I doubled the orchard's size and even organized a small community event, inviting residents to see the progress. Families came to plant seeds alongside me, and children ran around with excitement, imagining how the orchard might look in a few years' time. The shared hope was palpable. For a moment, Oak Springs felt like the close-knit community it once was, rather than a battleground for legal fights and corporate politics. Finally, the day of the decisive court hearing arrived. The county courthouse was busier than usual as people packed into the gallery. The local newspapers had covered the story so thoroughly that it sparked widespread interest. Even folks from neighboring towns showed up, curious to see the showdown between a private citizen and one of the most powerful HOAs in the region. Ms. Harding and the HOA's legal team wore solemn expressions, reflecting how high the stakes were. On our side, Sarah was impeccably prepared, carrying boxes of evidence, including aerial photographs, property surveys, county records, and, of course, my grandfather's final will. The entire orchard fiasco would now be examined under a legal microscope. The hearing proceeded methodically. The HOA attorney tried to paint me as someone who had only recently claimed the orchard existed, suggesting I was twisting documents to suit my narrative. He then produced a newer map from a planning commission, stating that since the orchard hadn't been maintained, the land defaulted to the HOA's oversight. Sarah dismantled his arguments one by one, referencing the Adams Conservation Clause and the incomplete annexation paperwork. The tension in the courtroom soared when we reached the potential collusion angle. Sarah presented the newly uncovered evidence that certain HOA members were in talks with a corporate development firm. When Ms. Harding was asked to address these rumors, she stumbled, claiming any discussions were purely speculative. But the smell of scandal hung heavy in the air. Before the judge adjourned for a lunch break, I took the stand to share my personal account. I described my memories of the orchard, my grandfather's vision, and the significance of reviving that piece of land. I talked about the intimidation tactics, the vandalism, and the heartbreak of seeing a fence built in the very place that once brimmed with fruit-laden trees. As I spoke, I saw some spectators visibly moved, while Miss Harding's expression hardened into a scowl. It was as if she realized that the public sentiment was squarely against her now. After lunch, the HOA tried to argue that removing the fence would pose a security risk to the community, but they offered no credible evidence for why orchard land on the very edge of the neighborhood required a fence for security. Their arguments seemed weak. Then Sarah, in a final flourish, displayed photographs taken of the orchard's revival, rows of newly planted saplings, local families joining in the effort, and a sense of shared stewardship. She ended with a quote from my grandfather's will: "May this land remain a sanctuary for growth, a reminder of simpler times, and a testament to the spirit of community." The courtroom fell silent. When the judge finally spoke, she made it clear that the burden of proof was on the HOA to demonstrate they had the right to the orchard land. Based on the evidence, she stated, they failed to meet that burden. She granted an immediate order for the fence's removal and instructed a thorough survey to be carried out under court supervision. If the orchard sat on my grandfather's property, it could not be claimed by any developer or the HOA without a proper legal sale. The gallery erupted in cheers. Ms. Harding and her lawyer exchanged grim looks, understanding that they'd lost a major battle. Meanwhile, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of relief. My grandfather's legacy was safe, at least for now. In the weeks that followed, the fence came down. It was an almost surreal sight. The same work crews, or perhaps different ones contracted by the HOA, dismantling what had been so confidently erected. Some neighbors watched from their porches, whispering about the downfall of the once invincible association. Others openly cheered, while a handful seemed resentful, still fearful that property values might suffer. Sarah and I continued to finalize the legal paperwork, ensuring the orchard's status was undisputed. The county even recognized the orchard's historical significance, granting me a small grant to help maintain it. Some local schools expressed interest in bringing students to learn about horticulture, and a few environmental groups offered to help me preserve the creek's ecosystem. The orchard was no longer just my personal domain. It had become a communal treasure. Despite the resolution in court, Ms. Harding and her allies weren't entirely disarmed. They tried to pass new HOA bylaws granting the association more power to protect the neighborhood's integrity. But after word got out about their failed land grab, residents voted down every draconian measure they proposed. A wave of reform swept through Oak Springs, culminating in the board's re-election. People demanded transparency and fairness, and many new residents joined the fight, determined to shape the neighborhood into something more inclusive. In the midst of all these changes, I continued my work on the orchard. Neighbors came and went, offering assistance, volunteering for planting days, or simply enjoying the shade of the young trees. For a community so long guided by rigid uniformity, it was a breath of fresh air to see people collaborating in a more organic way. One memorable autumn afternoon, I stood at the edge of the orchard, gazing at rows of young trees that were beginning to grow strong and tall. The crisp air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and I could almost feel my grandfather's presence, like a warm glow around me. As if timed by fate, I discovered another old letter tucked in one of his books that I'd only recently unpacked. He'd written, "Times change, and people can lose sight of what matters. But if you stay true to your roots, like these trees, you'll find you can weather any storm." Reading his words made me realize that the orchard was more than a piece of land. It was a metaphor for resilience and heritage. I recalled how, during the roughest points of the legal battle, I'd almost given up, but remembering my grandfather's unyielding spirit had pushed me to keep fighting. Eventually, the orchard became a venue for small community gatherings. Instead of high-strung HOA events that enforced strict dress codes, we now had informal get-togethers with potluck dinners and local musicians playing acoustic tunes. Families brought foldable chairs and blankets, sharing laughter under the stars. Sometimes, older residents would share stories of the orchard's past glory days. Their eyes sparkled with nostalgia as they described the sweet crunch of a freshly picked apple in summer. And younger folks, many of whom had never known the orchard's legacy, found themselves fascinated by the idea that a single piece of land could unite a neighborhood that had once been so divided. During this period of renewal, Ms. Harding unceremoniously resigned her position on the HOA board. Rumor had it that she faced internal backlash for leading the association into a costly legal battle that damaged its reputation. The rest of the board was reorganized as well, and their primary mission shifted from rigid enforcement to genuine community building. They even started a new committee focusing on conservation and neighborhood engagement. Ironically, the orchard they had once tried to fence off became a symbol of common ground, literally and figuratively. It took months before the orchard truly thrived, but by the following spring the blossoms were dazzling. Pink and white petals covered the branches, and honeybees buzzed in busy circles, pollinating the future fruit. The orchard felt alive again, as if it had been waiting for decades to reclaim its purpose. Local kids came for a spring festival, organized by a newly formed neighborhood council. They decorated the orchard with ribbons, laughter filling the air as they learned how to plant seeds and care for saplings. A sense of optimism permeated Oak Springs, a transformation from the days when residents feared petty fines and arbitrary rules. The orchard had gone from contested land to a cherished gathering place. And in that transformation, the neighborhood found a new identity, one rooted in heritage, cooperation, and mutual respect. In one final twist of fate, Tom, the retired county official who had first alerted me to the orchard's significance, brought over a rusted plaque he'd found in his garage. It read, "Adams Orchard, established 1952. He remembered my grandfather gifting it to him years ago, but they never installed it because the orchard was already well known at the time. Now it was more fitting than ever. A small crowd assembled on a sunny afternoon to watch me affix the plaque to a handcrafted wooden post at the orchard's entrance. We held a short dedication, and I shared a few words of gratitude, both for my grandfather's foresight and for the unwavering support from friends and neighbors who had rallied to my cause. It felt like a moment of closure, a sign that the orchard's future was secure and my grandfather's legacy had found a permanent home in the hearts of Oak Springs. This entire journey, from that jarring morning when I first saw the fence going up to this jubilant day unveiling the orchard plaque, taught me more than I ever anticipated. I learned that community isn't just a cluster of houses or a set of written rules. It's the bond people share when they stand together, uplift each other, and protect what's rightfully theirs. I learned that sometimes adversaries act out of greed or fear, but if you remain steadfast and collect the proper evidence, justice can prevail. Most importantly, I discovered that our roots, whether they be family legacies or core values, can guide us through the darkest controversies. My grandfather always believed in the power of growth, literal and metaphorical. In rekindling the orchard, I found a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper connection to my heritage. And in watching neighbors band together to reclaim Oak Springs from the clutches of a domineering HOA, I saw firsthand how a community could resurrect its own identity. Challenges still pop up now and then, but each time I walk between the rows of budding trees, I remember the unwavering determination that carried me through this conflict. I feel the gentle presence of my grandfather, as though he's quietly watching from a distance, smiling in approval. I'll never forget the day I saw that fence being torn down. Metal panels were hauled away on trucks, and every clank of steel against steel was like another link in the chain of oppression being broken. Standing there, I couldn't help but recall the hush in the courtroom when the judge declared the orchard was rightfully mine. It was more than a legal triumph. It was a victory for every person who has ever felt marginalized by faceless institutions or bullied into submission. In the aftermath, we not only removed a physical barrier, we dismantled a psychological one, allowing the neighborhood to remember its shared humanity. And here, at the end of it all, is the lesson I want to leave you with, something I've taken to heart through this extraordinary experience. Sometimes life places fences where they don't belong, whether they're literal barriers or figurative ones in our minds. But if you dig into your roots, gather allies, and stand firm in your convictions, even the tallest fences can be undone. We may not always win every battle, but if we fight for what matters, family, community, justice, we give ourselves a chance to grow something new from the ashes of conflict. Just like the orchard, which lay dormant for so long, we can bloom again when nurtured by hope, perseverance, and unity. That, in essence, is how my battle with the HOA became a catalyst for reawakening both my grandfather's cherished orchard and a sense of community that had been stifled by rigid regulations. Through setbacks and victories, betrayals and alliances, I discovered that the most significant fences are often the ones we build in our minds, ones that tell us we're too small to challenge a powerful force. But no fence is permanent, especially when it stands on ground that was never rightfully claimed. It took resilience, legal savvy, and the memory of my grandfather's unwavering spirit to tear that fence down. And in doing so, we all gained something far more valuable than land. We rediscovered each other. We remembered that neighborhoods are meant to be communities, not enclaves of control, and that a simple orchard can bring folks together in ways no law or regulation can replicate. So if you ever find yourself facing a fence that suddenly appears where it shouldn't, be it on your property or in some corner of your life, remember this story. Recall that beneath the tangle of bureaucracy and intimidation, you might find the roots of your own orchard, waiting to bloom. Hold fast to the things that matter, gather the knowledge and allies you need, and never forget that sometimes the best way to stand tall is to plant seeds of hope right where others tried to close you off. Just like those blossoms in the orchard, your perseverance can bear fruit far sweeter than any victory a letter of the law might grant. In the end, the orchard stands as a living testament to the power of ordinary individuals standing up for their rights and for the memory of those who came before them. My grandfather's name is forever etched into the story of Oak Springs, not as a footnote, but as a guiding beacon. And the people here, now free from unnecessary restrictions, have learned that power shouldn't reside in the few who stand atop a rigid hierarchy. Rather, it belongs to everyone who works together to protect the land they love and the values they cherish. Our orchard is no longer just a patch of land. It's a shared future, one that continues to bloom with every passing season. Finally, if I could sum up the most profound lesson learned from this entire chapter of my life, it would be this. True growth happens when we dare to challenge the walls, both literal and metaphorical, that keep us from the freedom to thrive. My grandfather's last will was more than a legal document. It was a testament to his faith in the enduring bond between people and the soil beneath their feet. As it turns out, that bond is far stronger than any fence could ever be. Let that knowledge remind you that when neighbors stand as one, hope blossoms in unexpected places. And that is how we all discovered, in the midst of a bitter battle for land, what it truly means to be a community.